Hello students, welcome to Mr. Giles' American Government class. We are on Chapter 3, Section 1, and we are going to be talking about the Constitution and how it is a blueprint for the United States government. And Cole Pennell told me I really had to spice it and jazz it up, so I'm really going to try and do that as much as I can jazz up American government. So our focus for this section is going over the 6 goals of the Constitution, the 6 principles of government in the Constitution, which are popular sovereignty, limited government. We'll talk about separation of powers and checks and balances, judicial review, and we'll be doing an activity on Marbury versus Madison, and federalism. The 6 goals of the Constitution were to form a more perfect union, which means to strengthen the relationship among states as part of the Union and between the states and the national government as part of a new federal system. Establish justice, which means providing laws that are reasonable, fair, and impartial, and make sure that the administration of those laws is also reasonable, fair, and impartial. Ensuring domestic tranquility, which means maintaining order within the country. Providing for the common defense, or defending the nation against foreign enemies, promoting the general welfare, allowing all states and citizens to benefit militarily and economically from the protection of a strong central government, and securing the blessings of liberty, which is basically protecting those civil liberties from which the American Revolution came from. One of the biggest dilemmas when it came to the problem of governing the people was allowing people freedom while also controlling people's human behaviors. It was written by James Madison in the Federalist Papers, number 51, about the dilemma, in which he basically stated if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And basically because they're not, it is. So a system of law was essential for this government to work. And as John Locke stated, where there's no law, there is no freedom, meaning that laws had to maintain order, protect people's rights, their property, and their lives. In order for any law or rule to be successful, it has to be enforced with an explicit threat of punishment. The government needed power to make laws and punish those lawbreakers, and also keep itself in check. So while we're thinking about what we might be assessed on a test, one of the questions that you'll probably have to be able to answer is what were the problems of governing that the framers faced. So the principles of government in the Constitution were to create a governing document, the Constitution, which would divide, distribute, and balance governmental power. The Constitution made almost all uses of government power subject to the will of the people through voting. When the Bill of Rights was enacted or included in 1791, it placed specific restraints on the power of government to make sure that people's basic rights weren't violated. The Constitution was a blending of ideas from the past, also from the Declaration of Independence, and it included 3 main goals: the preamble, which states the broad goals of government; the 7 articles, which briefly and vaguely describe the structure of government; and then the amendments, the 27 changes that were added throughout history. There are 6 basic principles that we'll go into greater detail, and they are popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, and federalism. If you're looking for a quick reference, you can find this in your book on page 70. And this will just kind of give you an idea of what each principle stands for. And make sure you're able to understand how the Constitution provides a blueprint for governing the nation. Popular sovereignty is the idea that government gets its authority from the people and political power remains with the people. The idea was to establish a republic, which would give the people authority, but not unlimited. It was not a direct democracy, and it placed some limits on popular sovereignty. There are a number of reasons for this, as you can probably imagine. I'd like you to consider what some of those may be. Why would the government, although worried about having too strong of a central government, not give unlimited power to the people? Well, one of the reasons came from James Madison, and he felt that the biggest threat to a government is factions. And that means people who have their own common interests. They could be a minority or a majority, but they might act in a way that hurt the rights of other citizens or the interests of the nation. So by electing people who represented a larger group of people, those factions would not necessarily exist. One could argue today that James Madison had quite a bit of foresight, because if you think about some of the things that exist today, like think tank and lobbyist groups, they actually have quite a bit of power in the political game. So by voting being the key to popular sovereignty, it allows voters to elect leaders or fire them who either represent them well or do not represent them. And it's an important power and important responsibility. In order for a republic to work, people have to exercise that right to vote. And citizens have an obligation to do it wisely and choose their leaders deliberately, or it could lead to factions, as Madison pointed out. The second principle is a limited government. Most Americans opposed too much government control in business and private activities. So the framers felt a limited government promoted its goals but also protected individual rights. Limited government is the principle that powers and functions of government are restricted. It's also known as the rule of law, the concept that every member of society must obey the law and is never above the law. You'll see the principle of limited government throughout the Constitution. Its list of powers is extensive, but some not listed are excluded. For example, in Article 1, Section 8, it defines powers of Congress, including the power to declare war, raise armies, and impose taxes, which is extensive, but anything not listed is implied as excluded. Some are specifically denied, such as in Article 1, Section 9, that denies Congress certain powers, such as the power to grant titles of nobility or pass laws that make criminal an act that was legal when it was committed. The Bill of Rights is also a safeguard, protecting individuals' rights such as freedom of speech and the right to a jury trial. Again, a vigorous civil society or voluntary civic and social groups that form with shared values, purposes, and interests also helps constrain government power by educating the public and making sure that people are informed when they go to vote. This holds the government accountable and helps to make sure that it never exceeds its power. So make sure you know how a civil society supports the principle of limited government, meaning how does an educated society that is aware of the issues in front of it help limit the government's power. The third principle is the separation of powers, which says that the governing duties are divided among three branches. This is done to ensure that not all power was in the hands of just a few people or a few agencies. In Article 1 of the Constitution, it creates a Congress, the lawmaking body of the nation, which includes a House of Representatives and a Senate, each with its own special powers. Of course, as you know, the legislative branch has the power to create laws. In Article 2, the executive branch was established, which is the president, the vice president, and many executive departments, which carries out laws passed by the legislative branch. And Article 3 established the judicial branch, including the Supreme Court. Its job was to exercise judicial power and interpret and apply laws that were passed. This diagram gives you a good idea of how the separation of powers works and how the three branches sort of check and balance each other, which is the next principle we'll get. The fourth principle is the system of checks and balances. Each branch has its own responsibilities that are not completely separate from each other, And this is designed so that no one branch can dominate or control government. And the idea is that the common good is maintained so that policies and actions that benefit all of society, not just one small group of people, or even a large group. So the idea of checks and balances is that each branch of government has the power to change or cancel acts of another branch. This system prevents exertion of too much power. For example, Congress checks the executive branch by controlling taxes and spending. They can reject nominations, such as top government jobs, and they must approve international treaties negotiated by the presidents by a 2/3 vote in order for agreements to become final law. Congress is also given the power to declare war and also limits the president's power as commander-in-chief. The executive branch, specifically the president, has the power to veto or reject legislation. In some cases, just the threat of a veto will help legislation get revised so it has a better chance of being signed. And the president can exercise veto power if necessary. On the flip side, Congress can override a veto with a 2/3 majority of both houses. If Congress can muster enough votes, then the bill can pass even without the president. The judicial branch can declare acts or laws unconstitutional through the power of judicial review through the Marbury versus Madison case. Federal judges are given lifetime terms, the idea being that they would be insulated from undue political influence. Judicial review is also balanced because the president has power to make federal judicial nominations, and Congress has the power to approve all federal and judicial nominations. Now, I know your head's probably spinning, but make sure that you can name at least one check or balance that each branch of government, has on the others. So who decides if a government action or new law agrees with the Constitution? Well, in the U.S., it's through the exercise of judicial review, which is the power to determine whether the actions of the legislative and executive branches of government are constitutional. Any law or action found to violate a part of the Constitution is said to be unconstitutional and acting illegal and cannot be enforced or carried out by the government. Although judicial review plays a pivotal role in our democracy, it is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. The writers of the Federalist Papers made it clear that the courts had such power. An independent judiciary would serve as a precaution against one branch becoming predominant over the others. It really didn't go effect, though, until 1803 in the Marbury versus Madison case. That being said, in Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, it does imply power when it says that the judicial power shall extend to all cases arising under the Constitution. We're going to get into Marbury versus Madison in class, but this just gives you a brief profile about the case and a little bit of background, but we'll talk more about it in class on Thursday. We'll also talk about some examples of how judicial review affects the citizens of the United States. The sixth and final principle of the Constitution is federalism, which states the powers of government are distributed between the national government and the state's government. The framers really struggled to find a good distribution of powers between states' rights and the power of the national government. One clause in particular, Article 6, also known as the Supremacy Clause, calls the Constitution the supreme law of the land, which upset states' rights people because they felt like that gave them too much federal power. So Amendment 10 addresses the issue, basically saying any powers that are not stated in the Constitution are powers granted to the state. There's a lot of language in the Constitution that allows for a strong federal government, but also guarantees states' rights and their ability to retain power. A strong national government is necessary for things like national defense, and those are spelled out in the Constitution. Please consider this final question and have a great evening. We'll see you Thursday.